Social justice warrior is an old term to describe woke leftists since 2010 that I'm sure everyone who is at least over 16 years old by now and has been on YouTube has used at some point of their life unironically.
Do you identify as black? No, it's a serious question because you might not identify.
When I walked into the room,
I am not done with my question.
The term quickly began falling out of fashion sometime around 2017 and 18 due to a series of reasons that I'll explore in this video, and not just fell out of fashion, but produced a large reaction towards the people which have used it in the first place.
The famous black communist.
Oh, communist. Should we be celebrating that?
Are you triggered?
Now, in this video, I will critically analyze how exactly had the anti-SJW culture rise and what had led to its downfall, and of course, most importantly, what can we learn from it. Now, obviously, before explaining the downfall of the anti-SJW culture on YouTube, it's probably worth mentioning why it has started in the first place. There is no one reason for it, but rather a collection of many circumstances that had played into it. First off, it is probably worth establishing a few fundamental facts about the culture of that time and of course, the primary viewers of that type of content. And the first thing which comes to your mind is the incredibly young population which was targeted by this type of content. You know, sometimes I read testimonies on BreadTube channels of people saying, oh, when I was 9 years old or something, I thought Ben Shapiro was cool because feminism was bad, and now I'm a social democrat who is now finally on my hormone blockers, or something along those lines, thanking ContraPoints for their de-radicalization or whatnot. But the fundamental point is that primarily those who were young and got indoctrinated into anti-SJW culture were easily swayed, and swayed very bigly in the following years. And now let's establish why such a change had occurred in the first place, before answering why it had undone itself and what we could learn about it. The surface level analysis would be to recognize an association of rebellion with the right wing and the establishment with the left wing. As I've mentioned before, many of these new anti-SJWs were young, but they were also gamers. Just at the exact moment when Gamergate had happened, by the way, Mantis Wave made a great video about explaining the context behind it, but either way, Gamergate has exposed many journalist fuck-ups and also the whole establishment as a malignant club of wannabe experts who are out of touch with reality, living in their own bubble of prejudice and dogma that could be expanded not just to Gamergate but to the whole establishment, while the forces that had opposed the journalists were rightly seen as those speaking out against power. Furthermore, much of the anti-SJW wave is a reaction towards speech codes which have now been further normalized in the West. Not bending a knee to the political correctness was seen as a form of protest. Hey, I'm not going to say Latinx, I'll say Latino. How does me saying that there are only two genders translates into violence? Now, for younger people, I presume it was about saying the N-word and being cool about it before watching ContraPoints. But for people like myself, it was a time dedicated to exploring hidden topics you should never talk about in polite discussions, such as immigration, biological group inequality, and etc. Political correctness was associated with deception and with the politics of language control, by which one can define reality. No, these are not illegal aliens, these are undocumented migrants. This is not violence, this is summer of love or peaceful protest. This is not Canadian truck drivers standing up to tyranny. This is an unacceptable fringe behavior which does not represent the views of most Canadians. You get the idea. The following and many other events that happened prior to 2018 and trending videos on student campuses had further solidified such a world frame, a frame which had associated rebellion with the right wing against this whole woke nonsense, which was seen as left wing, and teenagers love rebellion more than anything else. There's that good quote by Winston Churchill which says that any man under 30 years old who is not a liberal has no heart, and any any man over 30 years old who is not a conservative has no brains. But what it actually means is that any man under 30 years old who hasn't rebelled against the establishment and tried to make a world a better place was not an idealistic rebel, but any man who remains an idealistic rebel and does not become a part of the establishment is an idiot, because by being part of the establishment you get more social power. The establishment is leftist, and now the kids have grown up to support it, but I'll save that for later analysis. The general tone of the anti-SJW content has also played a significant role in its popularity. It was more or less easily constructed, being for the most part a reaction towards a series of nat-picked cases and the worst representation of leftism. The arguments of these leftists were often strawmanned and their rebuttals seemed good in comparison, and the audience didn't know much about politics either way. Funny enough, the counter-arguments anti-SJWs like Sargon have provided, aside from a rejection of anti-SJWs, were embracing of leftism light without all this wokeness, so that the viewers of this type of content would not tune out, and this became the foundation of the anti-SJW content on YouTube. The anti-SJW culture had really hit up when their ideology started to reproduce itself by people who are as good capitalists, do what's profitable, and satisfy the demand of their viewers, who increasingly started to become anti-SJW themselves.
Thanks, SJWs of YouTube. You just made me a shitload of money. Yeah.
That is to say that largely the anti-SJW content became a part of the mainstream consumption culture because people like Ethan Klein, The Amazing Atheist, Chris Reagan, Hunter Avalon, and other so-called past reactionaries and alt-righters, as some of them refer to themselves now, had simply capitalized on the interests of their listeners and gave them what they actually wanted and what was in demand at that particular time, without serious supporting basis for their ideology other than being against the establishment, which in a sense had co-opted a right-wing movement, associating it with rejection of the left but not of the embracing of the right. And such an ideology that is about rejecting an ideology and perhaps offering something not far distant to replace it, as in the case with Sargon of Akkad, had started to be reproduced all throughout YouTube. As you could generally tell, the anti-SJWs were kinda doomed from the start. They eventually would have simply been blown apart, and this is what had happened. As I've mentioned already, the anti-SJWs audience didn't come for genuine politics, but rather came for laughs, and given its mainstreaming, the anti-SJW sentiments became apolitical and didn't carry with themselves something inherently political, like the alt-right did, like the libertarians or the social democrats did. They didn't have a united ideology to rally behind as BreadTube did for a moment, and consequently they have also started fighting with each other. The skeptics turned on the alt-right had turned on Sargonite liberals, some like Thunderfoot became apolitical, someone started embracing extremism, driving away audience from themselves, someone got banned, and largely the anti-SJW YouTube channels have evaporated. But this is not the full story. Certainly infighting did play a role, but it wasn't infighting within the right, so why did most of the anti-SJWs become leftists in the following years? Well, it turns out, when you make your arguments against a strawman, lie about the data in order to make a point that your ideology demands you to make, people will eventually find it and expose you. This is what had exactly happened with Sargon of Akkad. This is what happened with Paul Joseph Watson, and this is what happened with PragerU and others. Their arguments were very easy to deconstruct, critique, and prove as false, because these people too, as it turns out, subscribe to a dogma that they cannot step outside, just like the crazy anti-SJW leftists and the journalists who support them.
Irish or German
statuses already exist,
or now Asian,
because there are disparities in outcome and achievement between the different racial groups.
Because it makes the fundamental fallacy of making race the central construct for understanding inequality. In other words, it commits the univariate fallacy of condensing everything down to race and putting it in a conflict theory sense.
So can I ask you a question? Are white people and black people biologically real?
Are they biologically what?
As in, like, can you have a biological classification of white and a biological classification of black that would hold up to any sort of scrutiny?
I mean, that's not exactly right. What you can actually do is you can have there are biological classifications of population groups spread throughout the planet. Some of them have different colors of skin. That actually you can't. It's not deniable.
Are these genetic clusters called race?
Race is a low-resolution, socially constructed category into which people...
It is socially constructed.
I don't disagree with you.
Who?
What I disagree with is Kimberly Crenshaw, where she says this social category is imposed, therefore we can't deconstruct it and walk away from it, mapping the margins near the end.
And again, the Y tree, where does culture come from?
I don't know. Why do Chinese people have a different culture than Americans? Is that racial?
If only there were some sort of means of investigating where these cultures come from. Perhaps it's
like that people have different backgrounds.
But be it as it may, they will not just defend indefensible positions, but actually lie to your face. They will say stuff like, the American founding fathers have dreamed of an equal society for all Americans, regardless of their race. They'll say that Abraham Lincoln wanted racial equality and not at all wanted to deport all blacks back to Africa. They'll say that MLK was a conservative. They'll say that the Southern strategy wasn't a thing, and this is just one topic, for God's sake. But they do have a deep interest in lying about this, and this is to fit the current leftist frame of what is acceptable. In a sense, they are trying to reinvent conservatism as being more appealing to leftists and individualistic liberals. They'll say that MLK is a conservative because they like him, as opposed to exposing him as a leftist and a frankly terrible human being, and of course critique him accordingly. They want to embrace him. And instead of saying the truth and standing up to power, they have decided to lie. The late 2016 and early 2017 has begun a year of a leftist resurgence on YouTube, which started gaining an audience by attacking the mainstream right. Kraut and T had tried to attack race realists, alt-hype and GF Gariepi, and we know how that went, but attacking people like Sargon of Akkad and Steven Crowder with his global warming denial was an easy target. Leftists knew very well who to engage and who to ignore. For example, there was no way someone can take, let's say, Jared Taylor apart, but someone like Sargon of Akkad, oh please, that's a cakewalk, because fundamentally Sargon of Akkad subscribed to our post-1945 morality, while Jared Taylor is pretty damn honest and accurate about what he is saying, so their basic tactic instead of engagement has been of isolation. But the key note from here is that Jared Taylor has been banned on frankly all social media, which is controlled by leftists, while some idiot like Steven Crowder and to some degree our PragerU are still around and acting the role of an easy opposition you could beat with reason, becoming a meme in the process. An opposition that agrees with you basically on like 80% of the things, but only disagrees about the means of how you can go about it. The often repeated arguments by the right since 2018 were accusing the left of hypocrisy. Oh, you are for worker co-ops, well, why don't you unionize your own company or your YouTube channel? Well, you don't like white privilege. Well, why don't you renounce your scholarship and fire yourself? Instead of critiquing such statements at their core and exposing it for what it is, at the same time as discrediting the idea of striving towards material equality and providing an alternative. What has infuriated me more than probably even the right-wing censorship was the general anti-intellectual tone of that right at the time, and I've actually made a video about it critiquing Caitlin Bennett as a prime example. Oh, clean your room. Oh, BS humanist degree. It's not the fault of society, it's your own fault. Be individualistic. Instead of looking at the problem more critically, adopting a micro-level analysis. This, in a sense, gave the impression to many people that the right is hiding something, that the right is protecting a certain system which, if was broken, would trigger a peace on earth, a worldwide communism or whatever else. And as you would imagine, leftists have used this opportunity to their advantage and played the greatest mind frame of this century, pretending that they're not in charge. I guess the biggest problem with the death of Anti-SJW YouTube is that famous YouTube pipeline which they all talk about has never existed, because ideally right-wingers should see how the arguments produced by, let's say, Emil Kierkegaard and G.F. Gariepi are much better than the strongest conservative you will ever come across. But because YouTube recommends content that is based on your interests, and you happen to watch Steven Crowder, PragerU, Alex Jones and Ben Shapiro all the time, well then good people that are really worth your time will never actually appear on your recommendation list. As a consequence of leftist attack on the right, the young and low information viewers who watch anti-SJW content started watching BreadTube, because to them the right has been exposed as people who make poor arguments and lie, and obviously the ones who make good arguments have been censored. The left was left with watching people like Ben Shapiro, who believes that global warming is not a big problem because the people living on the coast are not selling their houses, or whatever his reasoning is.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
Forget about biorealism, forget about anarcho-tyranny, forget about demographics. We have some trans people on TikTok who could get outraged at, because this is what we as the right should be engaged in. Definitely not in theorizing, definitely not in intellectualizing, but outrage porn. Endless amounts of outrage porn. Why provide an alternative when you can just critique the establishment? And if this is your political group, no wonder people don't want to be a part of you. Now, this is not to say leftists are much better. Their vision of society is fundamentally wrong, and they lie a lot. They lie more than right-wingers, and use their power to silence opposition, which is something that the right is not doing. But at the same time, the left provides an alternative and somehow have self-decepted themselves into being reformers. They also have produced an image that they are intellectuals who think in systems of power, material conditions, engage in a dialectic analysis, critique binary oppositions, and so on and so forth, and it turns out that a lot of people like that. I like that for sure. Finally, there is also the idea of social pressures, and these teenagers who finally grown out of their rebellious right-wing phase started to finally be integrated into society proper, not just internet, and if you have a poor social capital, well, your integration will be slightly complicated. Now, in order to remedy that, you have to believe the right things, otherwise there will be consequences, and the things you have to believe are biological group equality, affirmative action, teenager transition, increased immigration, hate speech, and general political correctness, which means on practice an organization of language that reaffirms leftist social control over language and the subsequent reproduction of leftism through language. You know, things you should actually be rebelling against. But to paraphrase Winston Churchill, if you have a brain and want to properly be socialized, you have to follow the ideology. But don't get too upset. I'm not saying the left winning is inevitable, though it is the case on YouTube for now. Remember, I told you before the anti-SJW culture really started to go mainstream before, of course, trembling into abyss. A similar process right now is undergoing among the left. There is a generation of retard leftists who don't know much about politics yet decide to speak on it, discrediting themselves in the process, looking dumb, and of course making their ideology look dumb. A good example of that is of course Adam Something, whose videos I have debunked with relative ease, not even worrying about the proper research, probably with as much as ease as H. Bomber Guy had debunked Paul Joseph Watson on soy, Steven Crowder, or other right-wing pundits. It was a cakewalk, and all because leftists like Adam Something don't need to rationalize their own positions. Other people will do the thinking for them. But as a result of that, people like me could easily pick their arguments apart and show the world what a fraud they are, and not just the arguments of someone like Adam Something, but also the arguments of more sophisticated leftists like PhilosophyTube, CountryPoints, HBomberGuy, Vash, Destiny, and many others, winning an audience in the process. Now, people like the Amazing Atheist, Hunter Avalon, H3H, and others switch sides because the laws of the market need to satisfy different demand, and just like in 2015 and 16, now they reproduce a different popular ideology to the same low politically illiterate viewers who can be swayed once again with better arguments. So in a sense, I'm actually kinda optimistic, as now it's time for a right-wing revival, and leftists are already sensing this new right-wing resurgence and already freaking out about it. But at the same time, H3H3, as is Candace Owens, are just able to properly sway low information viewers, thereby reproducing the social pressures but not good ideas, as they are too dumb to really grasp them themselves and justify these ideas, as well as responding to their critiques, because hiding behind someone big and going into a battle all by yourself are two different things. But either way, anti-SJWs are dead, and it is my belief that it's rather a good thing they're dead. It was truly cringe and made the right look weak. I would prefer an actual advocation of a right-wing policy over outrage porn any time of the week. But as I have mentioned, we see the early signs of a right-wing resurgence, which does not occur just on YouTube but on different platforms as well. And if we were to learn something from the anti-SJW crowd, is that the new right-wing ideology should not be built on lies, distortion of reality, outrage porn, lip service, and having no actual ideology behind it to replace the dominant one with. The left currently has a good understanding of what it wants, and the right doesn't, as it prefers to be divided and marginalized still. The real lesson of the past years on YouTube is that you need a good solid foundation for your ideology, which then could be mainstream top-down to low information viewers and apolitical people who will carry your torch forward. But for now, although there are signs of the right finally starting to produce better arguments than leftists, though still within their moral framework, the right is still not close to producing a foundational political theory which the new intellectuals will carry forward, thereby top-down spreading this ideology around. Dugin was an embarrassment. The closest we got there was with the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, which is a critique of power and of course sociobiology and Darwinism, an understanding of human behavior, but we're still left with coming up with a prescriptive call to action ideology we could all agree on and push forward. And for the meantime, things will remain the same, us being divided and marginalized, though some of us producing fine arguments since the late 19th century, like some fine wine or a good piece of architecture that we're not building anymore, and of course most of us watching Alex Jones thinking that the guy's legit and totally makes a lot of sense. But for a minority of my audience, I advise you to take the matters into your own hands. Future will not take care of itself.